They struck Los Angeles like a lightning bolt, fast, fierce, and unstoppable. No badges, no warnings, just sharp suits, Tommy guns, and a ruthless resolve that made them feared. In the 1940s, the LAPD formed a secret team known only as the Gun Squad. Their mission wasn't to make arrests or ask questions, it was to make bodies disappear. They were the city's deadliest weapon, but today, few even know they existed. So here's the question. What happens when those sworn to protect become executioners? Today, we reveal the hidden story of the LAPD's most dangerous unit, how they rose, how they got away with murder, and finally, how everything came crashing down. In the early 1920s, Los Angeles was transforming. Oil fields had turned empty land into booming towns, while the exploding movie industry brought fame, money, and a flood of new residents. And this was when thousands arrived each month, chasing opportunity. However, rapid growth came with consequences. During Prohibition, smugglers set up massive underground operations. Bars looked like they disappeared, but they just went private. Secret bars popped up all over the city, usually protected by gangsters who didn't mind using violence. Bank robberies happened all the time, and alcohol was flowing freely in both fancy clubs to run-down basements. Shootouts often broke out in broad daylight, with criminals driving faster cars and carrying more firepower than the average patrol officer could handle. The police found themselves overwhelmed as robberies grew bolder and gangs became more organized. Regular beat cops simply couldn't keep up with criminals armed with Tommy guns and speeding around in souped-up Ford V8s. Hence, it became clear to city leaders that the old ways of handling crime were no longer enough. So in 1923, Police Chief Louis D. Oakes authorized something radical. He assembled a small, deadly team, unlike anything the city had ever seen. They were officially called the Gun Detail. However, among locals, they had a much darker nickname, the Murder Squad. This unit had fewer than a dozen officers, picked for one clear reason. They were ready to do what no one else dared. They weren't the kind to fill out reports or talk to neighborhoods. They were chosen because they were willing to call. These men wore sharp suits, fedoras, and plain clothes, matching the gangsters they hunted to blend seamlessly into the city's underworld. And their cars looked ordinary at first glance. But underneath the surface were stripped down, reinforced cruisers built for speed and surprise. These vehicles also had hidden compartments stocked with deadly weapons like machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, ready for any violent encounter that might come their way. Well, the Gun Squad was never really expected to make arrests. That wasn't the point. But instead of playing by the rules, they worked in the shadows, using violence over paperwork to keep the streets in check. You'd think they were out to stop crime, but in some ways, they were becoming part of it. They weren't just patrolling bad neighborhoods. They were moving through them like hunters, sent into Bunker Hill, Little Tokyo, and the early Skid Row with just one goal: end the threat before it reached the headlines. Therefore, they had to be ready for anything and ready to end it fast. Nevertheless, they didn't rush in blindly. Instead, they watched quietly, gathered information from trusted sources, and waited for the perfect moment to act. When they got the right tip, they rushed quickly and without a second. They'd strike hard and fast to take down their targets before anyone could react. Their attacks left little room for escape or resistance. There were no arrests, no court dates, just dead bodies and clean exits. The public didn't know all the details, but the newspapers gave them just enough to be impressed. Between 1923 and 1929, the gun squad was involved in more than 24 documented shootouts, and likely many more that never made it to official records. To the city's newspapers, they were legends. Headlines called them heroes. Police gunmen drop bandit in broad daylight. LAPD foils bank raid. Robber shot dead in street. The stories were dramatic, bloody, and always framed as a win for justice. Criminals were dying, and most people didn't ask why or how. And if anyone needed proof if their tactics were working or not, all they had to do was look at what happened on Hill Street in 1925. A group of armed men tried to rob a jewelry store on Hill Street. The gun squad got a tip beforehand and were already waiting when the suspects showed up. The shootout was quick and short. 2 robbers lay dead in the gutter. Not a single officer was injured. The press called it a textbook takedown. But others started to notice something strange. Many of the victims were found shot in the back. Some didn't appear to have even fired a weapon. And in multiple cases, evidence turned up that seemed a little too convenient. Pistols resting just inches from a suspect's hand, even when witnesses claimed they hadn't been armed. Behind closed doors, the phrase, "death before trial," began to spread. It was not a mere slogan, it was a policy. As the body count rose, the whispers grew louder. Community leaders began to speak out. Some accused the LAPD of running a death squad under the cover of public safety. Others demanded to know how many of these so-called criminals were killed before they ever had a chance to defend themselves. And when reporters began digging deeper, things only got worse. Some gun squad officers had known ties to smuggling operations. One was seen at a gambling house protected by the mob. Another had unexplained money flowing through his accounts. There were credible reports that certain squads were playing both sides. That is, protecting one gang in exchange for cash while gunning down their competition in the streets. Weapons were rumored to have been planted after killings. Files went missing. Officers rotated to different precincts whenever questions got too loud. Most of the city didn't want to hear it. Crime was down, the headlines looked good, and as long as gangsters were the ones dying, few people cared how it happened. But that changed when the gun squad killed someone they weren't supposed to. In 1929, the gun squad moved in on a robbery in East Los Angeles. And as the suspects ran, one of them, a 17-year-old boy, took off down the alley. But when officers opened fire, he fell immediately, shot in the back while trying to run away. He was not armed, no gun, no knife, nothing at all. Hence, questions started to rise. Why was an unarmed teenager gunned down in the street? This time, the headlines weren't flattering. The public was outraged. Civil rights groups demanded action. Church leaders spoke out. Even members of the city council called for an investigation. Mayor George Cryer, who was under growing pressure, ordered a full review of gun squad activity. What that investigation uncovered was explosive. There were dozens of unsanctioned raids, operations that were never approved or recorded. Many police reports were missing or altered. Several officers had ongoing relationships with known underworld figures. One was even taking bribes from a smuggling ring, while simultaneously killing its rivals. The LAPD tried to contain the damage. Some officers were reassigned to desk jobs, while others quietly resigned. Public statements were vague, and internal memos vanished. By 1930, the gun squad was officially disbanded. Their existence was erased from city records. What remained were a few yellowed newspaper clippings and a pile of unanswered questions. But their impact was impossible to erase. Today, the LAPD gun squad is barely a footnote in official police history. Their name doesn't appear in most records. Their stories aren't told at the academy. And the city has done everything it can to forget them. But that kind of power doesn't just disappear, it echoes. The gun squad didn't just blur the line between justice and vengeance, they crossed it over and over, and they were praised for doing it. They were called heroes, but they acted like outlaws. Their legacy is a warning about what can happen when the people sworn to uphold the law are given permission to break it. This wasn't just a crime story. It was a story about a system that rewarded violence until it couldn't anymore. Don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories coming. Stories that history tried to bury, but we're digging up anyway. If you thought this story was wild, watch this video because it is as thrilling as this was. Click here to watch it now.